This is Bill Now speaking. Welcome to the truth about the Philadelphia experiment. You're about to experience an amazing story. It's a story that I've spent many years investigating. I like to call this part of the presentation the interview. It was filmed in 1989, but that doesn't make it any less relevant. In fact, it's become more relevant. A number of other witnesses have come forward since that time to verify the information that you'll see here. The interview comprises two stories that are intertwined: the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk project. The Philadelphia experiment had several purposes. It began as a World War II Navy project to demagnetize ships against a new type of German mine that was attracted to the magnetized metal of vessels. The degaussing of ships tended to be an arduous process in those days, and it involved a stay in dry dock, and most of the electronic equipment on board a ship had to be removed while it was being degaussed. This was a method that was really impractical for wartime use. The creation of a strong field of some type that could be controlled to instantly demagnetize ships proved to be a much better idea. Each ship could be provided with the necessary equipment that would be carried on board at all times, so that the degaussing process could take place at any time. Although the degaussing aspect of the Philadelphia experiment was promising and important, it was in no way the end game. The second and more important goal of the Philadelphia experiment was to make Navy ships invisible to radar. It's no secret that the Germans were developing powerful radar systems in those days that could track ships from a great distance. In fact, by 1942, plans were already underway to equip new German multi-purpose aircraft with radar-guided bombs. Information obtained after the war proved this fact to be true. The scientists and engineers that developed the technology for the Philadelphia experiment saw the degaussing work as a way to get their feet in the door with the military. They had ideas that went far beyond degaussing and radar invisibility, but the demagnetizing project allowed them access to government officials and government money. With a potential price tag of millions of dollars for what they really had in mind, they needed time to explain and prove their ideas to the military. The Navy was the perfect start. President Franklin Roosevelt had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy under President Woodrow Wilson and was appointed to that position in 1913. Now as president, he was known to have a great deal of respect and affection for the Navy. He'd certainly be interested in anything that would help military vessels evade U-boats and enemy ships. You'll hear more about the history of the experiment during the interview, but the end game for the scientists and engineers involved was complete invisibility and more. With a one-time chance at millions of dollars in government money that would likely go away after the war, they had a chance to take pet theories and ideas and turn them into reality. Knowing how notoriously skeptical naval officers were about new technologies and ideas, they had to prove that the ideas could work, and did so by staging demonstrations and tests over a period of time. Not all the tests went well, as you'll see, and it was obvious that more control over the new technology was needed, but the scientists and engineers involved produced results that the Navy could not ignore. The Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton University in New Jersey was the home of most of the scientists and engineers involved with the Philadelphia experiment. Einstein made his home at the Institute and is said to have been involved directly with the experiment. It's a historical fact that he was under contract to the Department of the Navy during World War II. The work he did for them remains secret. Other great minds, like John von Neumann and Nikola Tesla, were also involved. A number of the prodigies who worked with these great minds also worked on the Philadelphia experiment. I tend to believe that the entire saga began because these prodigies urged Einstein and others that they worked for to pursue the practical application of theories they developed at the Institute by contacting the military. If these theories could be proven true, there could be a chance at millions of dollars in government money, and actually this would be a chance for the prodigies to establish their own reputations and their own areas of development using those much-needed government funds. With the nearby Philadelphia Naval Shipyard and its assets placed at their disposal, things moved forward to the point where sea trials of the technology were planned and carried out in the early 1940s. During one of these trials, a hyperspace portal, or window, or stargate if you will, was opened, which transported two of the sailors from the test ship to another place in space and time. That place was the Montauk base, where the technology originally developed from the Philadelphia experiment was now being used on even more advanced and bizarre projects, as you'll soon see. The time was the 1980s, and the place was the eastern end of Long Island, near the historic Montauk Lighthouse. There's a great deal more to this story, and I'll allow the interview participants to fill in the blanks for you. And you'll certainly want to listen carefully because it's quite a story. When I first went to this special event, I must say I was skeptical and ready not to believe most of what was going to be said, simply because it didn't fit into what I thought about technology and government and things of that nature, even though I've been a paranormal investigator for many years and investigated a number of outrageous UFO claims, some true, some not. But I did approach it as objectively as possible. And in fact, as you'll see, I brought people with me to help verify these claims. But let me give you a little bit of information about the people that were involved in this interview session. Let's begin with Preston Nichols. He was born on Long Island, New York, in 1946. He has degrees in parapsychology, psychology, and electrical engineering. Preston worked for most of his life in defense electronics and wound up at Brookhaven National Labs and AIL. In 1968, Preston's involvement with Montauk began. He got involved with the tail end of stealth research at AIL. Preston was told that the research started right after the Philadelphia experiment. He actually read the final report of Project Rainbow, which was what was known as the Philadelphia experiment in those days. The report named the Cameron brothers as being the Navy liaison in the experiment. Next, he got pulled into the Mind Sciences project at Montauk. They were working on interfacing a person's mind to a computer. Preston worked with Al Bielek on the psychic aspects of the Montauk Chair and the Montauk Boys program. Preston trained the Montauk Boys to be PSI warriors. The Montauk Chair used subtle quantum fields to read a person's thoughts. The psychic would lay in the chair, go into a trance, and a group of coils picked up the emanations. A bank of radio receivers designed by Tesla could pick up and digitize the thought, turning thought into computer code. The radar tower was used to turn thought into reality. This chair was used for many purposes. One was to open up a vortex for time travel. Many Montauk boys were lost due to the initial testing of the time vortex. Now let me introduce you to Al Bielek. Al Bielek has led a life that most would not choose to lose. While many would think that time travel, meeting aliens, and working on secret projects are exciting ventures, Al paid a big price for the privilege. Because those who set the agenda wished to keep their activities secret, Al was robbed of his family, his memories, and ultimately his identity. They used advanced technologies to erase what was dear to him. However, their technologies were not perfect. Slowly but surely, the memories came back to Al. Al started meeting others who had been through the same process, and ultimately a flood of memories returned that would allow him to tell his story in his own words. Al has been involved for many years in electrical engineering. Duncan Cameron is one of the central figures in the Philadelphia experiment and Montauk Project saga. According to Al, Duncan was his brother when Al was at Cameron, who jumped off the USS Eldridge in 1943 and landed into the future. When they wound up in 1982 or 83 at Montauk, they were both sent back to the USS Eldridge to destroy the equipment that was keeping the ship in hyperspace. Al Bielek says that before the Eldridge rematerialized, Duncan jumped back off the ship and returned back to 1983. He was used extensively as a psychic in the Montauk project. He became one of the principal psychics who manned the Montauk chair. The chain was used to create and hold the frequency required to perform the time travel and mind control activities. If this plot, if you will, sounds suspiciously like the theatrical movie, The Philadelphia Experiment, it should. It's thought that the movie came out at a time and was produced at a time when basically the story of Montauk was going to come out anyway, because despite all the brainwashing techniques that were being used and thought masks, some of the people remembered. And what a great way to have plausible denial if a movie were to come out before anyone talked, and the movie was obviously portrayed as a fictional story, so that anyone telling a story after that would be thought to be claiming something that was nothing but pure fiction. The interview was filmed by me in the Long Island home of a friend of Preston and Al. With strange cargo vans circling the neighborhood while the session was conducted, on a chilly day after Thanksgiving in 1989, and lots of nervous participants, I filmed as best I could without special lighting or anything that might detract those present from the task at hand. I was able to use microphones placed near those that were involved, so the sound quality isn't bad. Among those present at this sort of micro event were a small, specially invited group of paranormal researchers, psychics, and journalists. A friend of mine who wrote a number of technical manuals, including some for the space shuttle, and also worked in the defense industry, was there to provide me with verification of the technological claims by Preston and Al. Not only did he verify, but hearing the story kept him up for days afterward and made him wonder why he and others working on government contracts were not allowed access to this amazing technology.
Thank Preston, Al, and Cameron for being here tonight. Really, for all of us eccentrics, we are thoroughly pleased to hear about the Rainbow Project, the Philadelphia Experiment, the Phoenix Project, all that good stuff. And so I guess you can all take it the way you want, as one after another, while he puts on his sunglasses. And this is really, I think, a memorable event. And so you guys can take on the project, and thanks for being here. Go ahead.
Preston, why don't you start? All right. Well, we're here tonight. We have with us Mr. Bielek, who is from the Eldridge for the Philadelphia Experiment, the older fellow that went back to 43. We also have with us Mr. Cameron, who is also off the Eldridge. Two of the craziest people in the world.
Now, compliment.
They're not so crazy, they survived. Here at the auspices of the, what's it, Galuppi?
Yeah, Filippo Galuppi.
Galuppi brothers.
Right.
We're here in this nice, beautiful home in Blue Point. This home has to be at least $250,000.
I hope so. Three-quarter.
Or $750,000, whatever. And I don't know what we're going to talk about.
Why don't you start with what Montauk was about, how it tied into the Philadelphia Experiment.
A brief synopsis, maybe, of the...
Okay, first of all, I got to find the
However, you want to start with Philadelphia and then go to however you want.
Well,
how it ties in?
I first have to find the power cord. I got a place to plug this power cord and start up the tape recorder.
Go.
There, plugged in. Alright, way back when. Let's start with the Phoenix Project. Phoenix Project is a carry-on from the Philadelphia Experiment. That was a...
Can you hear them? Can you hear them okay?
That was a silly little project that the Navy did back in the 30s and the 40s, attempting to make a battleship invisible. They wanted to make an aircraft carrier invisible. They threw the switch one eventful day, and the ship went into hyperspace, caused all sorts of problems for the people on the boat. Navy said the thing's a huge failure, it's a huge success, but it's also a huge failure, and they shelved it. In about 47, it was decided, the government can't leave this thing alone. They got a wild effect that they wanted to study. So in 47, they reopened it and started up with what we came later to know as the Phoenix Project. It was originally the Rainbow Project. It was moved to Brookhaven National Laboratories, and Dr. von Neumann and all his associates, this was long before any of us were involved in it, started to replicate this thing. Out of the Phoenix 1, the early project, came the stealth technology, which I cannot talk about. Neither of these two guys could talk about the stealth technology, but I cannot talk about it because of my job. And also came out all sorts of energetic little toys, such as radio songs. What is a radio song? Well, if you remember all back when we were kids, we saw these little white plastic boxes that had a white bottle hanging down on it, that they connected to a little red parachute, filled up a balloon with helium, connected the whole thing, and up in the atmosphere it went. The government told us, hey, this thing is a weather data package. It has a temperature sensor, has a humidity sensor, and it has a pressure sensor in it. And this thing will ultimately transmit temperature data, humidity data, temperature data, reference data. And the switching was controlled by the barometric pressure at the height by what they call the baro switch. This thing used a very unusual type of pulse modulation. In most cases, they used a CW, continuous wave oscillator, and pulsed the thing off. The pulse was pulsing it off. This turned out to be a very efficient conversion of electrical energy to etheric energy. Now, I very recently started collecting radio songs. I don't know why, but I did. I walked in with a radio song, and one of the associates at Space-Time Laboratory says, things are a weather control device. So, of course, that piqued my interest. I'd already known that the humidity sensor was terrible. Its accuracy was a lot to be desired. I'd known the temperature sensor was terrible, and its accuracy had a lot to be desired. And the other unusual thing that I wondered about is, yeah, I can get all the radio sounds I want. I've never, ever seen a receiver for them. So, we first did a quote-unquote psychic reading. See, Space-Time Laboratories, everybody uses CAD, computer-aided designs. At Space-Time Laboratories, we use psychic-aided design. So we had a number of different psychics read on the radio songs. Weather control device, doorbuster, orgone enhancer. That's the readings that came through. So I got very interested, and I started to ask around about radio songs. The next thing I found out by word of mouth is these things were designed at Brookhaven National Laboratories up in Long Island, New York, just up the road from this place. And I started to talk to people I know at Brookhaven. Ran across a retired gentleman from Brookhaven who wishes to remain nameless, so I won't name him. He'll stay anonymous. He told me that the design was originally done by a character by the name of Wilhelm Reich. Of course, that piqued my interest even more. Wilhelm Reich. The story goes that in about 47, Mr. Reich handed the U.S. government a weather control device, a little package that would do door busting. He felt that if he could reduce the amount of door and increase the orgone in the storm wouldn't be violent, it wouldn't have winds, and it wouldn't do the damage. It would be a less violent storm.
What is the DOR?
Deadly orgone. Dead orgone. That's the bad stuff.
And where does that come from?
No one really knows where it comes from. I've heard a number of theories. Well, essentially, orgone can be considered like life energy, energy from life forces, energy from living beings. Dead orgone is same type of energy but dead. It doesn't have any life in it. It has a tendency to decrease life functions. It reduces life functions. So the government took this little widget that Mr. Wright handed them. He told them, put it on a balloon, send it up. Of course, they put a parachute on it because they didn't want the thing coming down with a big, loud, crashing bang through somebody's skylight, and the government gets sued for all sorts of money. And they send the thing up into a bad storm, and it gets reduced in intensity tremendously. So the government goes back to Reich and says, hey, we like the thing. So they launch another part of the Phoenix Project where they design these radio signs. This is almost like a little subsection of this, by the way, this story. Now, of course, I dug further and further into it. As I already noted, I talked of the receiver. There are instances where we know they launch these things from every boat at sea, every airport, every weather station. They launch them from planes. At one point in the 50s, there must have been maybe 200 to 500 of these things launched every day. The radio range, being a radio person, I can tell you about that. I checked it. The radio range on these transmitters, even up in the air, maybe is 100 miles. So that means when they launch one of these frequencies, there has to be a receiver close by. They're going to send up a data transmitter, and now they have to have a receiver. That means if they're sending 200 or more of these things up each day, it's got to be one pile of receivers. These receivers should be very common. Now, I happen to be a receiver collector. I have over 100 receivers in my personal collection of receivers. I have never seen a radio sound receiver. I've heard them, but I've never seen one. I got almost every other receiver that was used in the 40s and the 50s by the military.
I have a question. What is the center frequency without modulation on the radio sound transmitter?
403 megahertz and 1680 megahertz. They use two different frequencies.
They're both on simultaneously?
Huh?
They're both on simultaneously?
No, it's one or the other.
One for primary and one for secondary?
No, it's one transmitter or the other transmitter that's in the package. The early ones are on 403. The later ones,
exactly?
plus or minus 2 megahertz. And the later ones are on 1680 plus or minus about 6 megahertz.
They were crystal tuned or?
No, they're just free-running oscillators.
Free-running oscillators.
The 400 megahertz, I was going to get into the details, the technical details, how the radio sound worked. All right, this is a good time to go into that. I don't have any illustrative material, so I'll have to attempt to describe to you people how the circuitry worked. It's a very unique system that they had. Essentially, the temperature element was a thermistor type. It is a negatively varying resistance with the temperature. As the resistance goes up, as the temperature goes up, the resistance goes down. Now, I had a mass spectrograph done on one of these thermistors, and I compared it to a YSI thermistor. And they both have carbon in them. They both are essentially carbon, but the radio sound thermistor had some silver in it, had some gold in it, had some platinum in it, had some iridium. I'm trying to remember the other two elements it had. It has a fair amount of silver in it. Silver was about 10% by weight. Now, for a thermistor, it's not going to make it any more accurate. If anything, it's going to make the curve go really strange. You're doping it with metals like that. Of course, you read Wilhelm Reich literature, you'll find out Reich used sensors that had gold and silver in them. That's one interesting note there. The humidity element is a plastic plate with silvered edges with a grid of conductive lines going across the plastic plate. This way and this way. This way, this way, this way, this way, this sort of thing. They put on it a very odd mix of chemicals. The chemistry lab has not come back yet what the mix of chemicals is they put on it. Now, the unusual thing about the temperature and the humidity element is most electrolytic resistors I've ever seen, the resistance goes down as they get damp. These things, the resistance goes up as they get damp. Now, what we're theorizing at this point, which we've proven from the esoteric side, we have no physical data to back it up, is that the thermistor rod, the temperature sensor, the temperature rod, acts like an antenna for the door. It acts like a door antenna out of phase. That's the dead orgone. The humidity sensor acts as an antenna for the orgone. Of course, this parallels the whole idea of, you'll see in esoteric circles, people use salt water solutions with different electrodes in them to detect these energetics, with a fair degree of success. Looks like here, Wright took it much further. Now, the pressure sensor is essentially what they call a barrow switch, or a pressure-sensitive cycling switch. As the thing would rise, the pressure would change, and the needle in the little barometer would go across a switch segment, hit the segments of a switch. That drove a relay that would in sequence put either the temperature or the humidity sensor back and forth. It would switch between these two sensors. Then it was switched to, which I'll explain in a minute how it's done, to what they call a reference mode in the transmitter. So what they have, as this thing rises and goes above the earth, it transmits a signal that destroys the door, and it also transmits a signal after that, or before, however you look at it, that builds up the orgone energies. Now, let's consider the transmitter. The transmitter is a very interesting little beastie. It is two oscillators. An oscillator that runs at the carrier frequency, the 403 megahertz or 1680 megahertz. There's a second oscillator, which is a 7 megahertz oscillator coupled into the grid of the carrier oscillator. Now, the control grid of the modulation oscillator, the 7 megahertz oscillator, has an RC network that causes it to do the relaxation number. Now, as the oscillator runs, it builds up DC across the grid when the capacitor that's in the RC network for the relaxation oscillator, I have to apologize, I don't have any schematics with me. I didn't expect to talk at this, but there was interest at the table. As that capacitor will build up high enough in charge to put a high negative bias on the grid of the tube, cut the tube off, the oscillator will stop oscillating, of course. The RC network would discharge and pull the voltage down on the capacitor just like a neon bulb oscillator. So essentially that 7 megahertz oscillator would pulse on and off. Now, the lower the resistance, the faster the pulsing would be, and the higher resistance, the slower the pulsing would be. I'm trying to make this as clear as I can without having a schematic to point out. I don't know, are the two people here following what I'm saying that have some technical background? Now, they did not couple the 7 megahertz directly into the grid of the carrier oscillator. It couples in through an RC network where the first resistor is in series with the plate coils. Between the B plus and the B plus end of the plate coil, they have a capacitor going to ground, a bypass capacitor that integrates the function. Then they RC couple with a series capacitor and a resistor going to ground on the oscillator of the carrier oscillator. Well, what happened, whenever the modulation oscillator would click in, turn on, it would cut off the carrier oscillator and shut it off. Of course, etheric signals are already differentiated, so it means when you put the differentiated signal through the integrated network, it comes out in its real form in that final amplifier, that final oscillator.
Wouldn't that circuit also attenuate the instantaneous spike? In other words, like there's a de-emphasis network.
Yes,
From
that's what
primary oscillator. That was the intent, wasn't it? primary oscillator in the
We don't know
RC?
what the intent was behind it. That's what it appears to be. It's an integrator, which is a de-emphasis.
Right.
A differentiator is your emphasis network. You're thinking of. See, in engineering, as a technician, you talk of de-emphasis and emphasis. In engineering, we talk of integration and differentiation. And being trained in that's what I talk of. So the etheric signal or the hyperspatial signal, the orgone is already differentiated. It can't do anything. It's 90 degrees out of phase to begin with. This integration network brings it back in phase for the transmitter to transmit it. Now, also, you have to keep in mind that when the tube goes from a semi-saturated mode, as it is when the carrier oscillator is oscillating the cutoff, there are other things taking place from the zero-point potential. When the tube is cut off, any of the etheric signal that's stored in the tube will be pushed out the antenna. Also, when you cut the tube off, when you go from saturation to cutoff, and from cutoff to saturation again, you're essentially ripping open the vacuum from the viewpoint of the Dirac space that he derived in the 30s. And you'll get an amplification. If these transmitters only put out about a half a watt of CW RF power, the etheric content or the non-real power was equivalent to about 250 watt transmitter. That's how efficient these little things were.
Can you describe the phase relationship between the RF output power and the etheric power and the frequency difference between the two?
Okay, the frequency should be the same. The phase relationship...
Cosine?
Hmm?
Would it be a cosine function?
Let's see, what would it be? It would have to be, it would come out of the differential equation relating the baseband to the carrier frequency. I think it'd be a tangent. I think it's a tangent function.
So it would rise sharply.
Yeah.
Until the next cycle.
Mm-hmm. That tells you that sends out the etherics in bursts. In other words, when this transmitter runs, the CW part of it, when the oscillator is on, it doesn't put out much etherics. But at the point where the oscillator shuts off, it sends out a huge burst of etheric signal. That's your tangent function. I just had to think for a minute of what it would be, the question, answer your question.
I have a totally different question. Who was in charge of this project, of the doorbusters? What department of the government?
This was under United University's Brookhaven National Labs. It was eventually turned over to the Signal Corps. Because most of these things were U.S. Army Signal Corps stuff. Even the one set up from the Weather Service was Signal Corps. So Signal Corps had ultimate charge of it.
So as you're talking about this whole system, how does that now get into what was happening in the 40s and the 80s?
Okay, let's finish this off a little. Where was I? Questions always break the train of thought.
You were describing basically the system
Right.
of the doorbusters.
All right, the government could not tell the public that these things were weather control devices. They were keeping that secret. How'd they guard the secret? Two ways. They first showed a few receiving stations constructed to receive these things, put out that line. The personnel that launched them would laboriously calibrate them. Thirdly, the special tube that's in the radiosondes, they would list in the tube manual as a whole bunch of baloney. Essentially, they'd be saying that only a few hours of life. That means if the ham over there picked one up, looked at the tube manual, the 7533 is only going to last a few hours, he's not going to use it. And that worked very well. As I already mentioned, I've never seen a receiver. That says they didn't use a receiver with these things. This is why, this is the hard data, besides the psychic data I base that the story is correct. All right, what we're seeing here actually is in actuality the genesis of the Montauk Project. The Montauk Project was Phoenix 2. The Montauk Project is a combination of Wilhelm Reich's work in the Philadelphia experiment. It was like two separate little projects going on in Phoenix 1. You had the development of the invisibility and its human factor study. Also, you had the development of Wilhelm Reich's weather control.
So that was Phoenix 1?
Yeah, that's Phoenix 1, and they converged. towards the end of the Phoenix project, by using some of Wilhelm Reich's concepts and some of the modulation schemes gleaned from the Radioson project, coupling, I know you're looking puzzled, this is what I found last week. Coupling that to the equipment that was used on the boat in the later invisibility project, they found out you couple the two, you now could use this for mind control. I'm not saying mood alteration. I know Governor Circle would rather have me say mood alteration. Here, I'm calling a spade of a spade. Mind control. That's what these idiots were doing. They're not actually idiots. That's what these people were doing.
That's what the Montauk project was?
No, the Phoenix One.
Phoenix One.
The end of Phoenix One, of course, what happened? Congress, the political government heard, hey, these guys are playing with mind control. They don't want that. So they told them, hey guys, cut it out. We don't want you looking into mind control. That's a no-no. So, of course, the project was stopped. It was shut down. Does anyone here think it was really shut down? No, of course not. The people that were running this project went to the military and said, hey, we got this neat little, nifty little project going. We can eventually use this to influence the mind of the enemy to give up and to surrender. We need a place to do this. We got to do this undercover now. So, of course, the military, they love the idea. You know, they love something, throw a switch and the enemy puts down all their weapons and comes up hands in the air. They love this. So the military was sold a bill of goods. And the military was said, okay, you can use the old Montauk Air Force Base. It's dead, it's derelict. Also, some of the equipment you requested is on that base, the old Sage radar. So the base was shut down, everything was auctioned off, but the Sage radar was left behind. And the whole group moved from the Brookhaven Labs out to Montauk. That's Phoenix 2. Of course, they spent the first 10 years, from about 1969 to about 1979, researching pure mind control. They started out by taking the output of the Sage radar, modulating it to special ways that they came up with that Reich had shown them from the weather control process, and combining that with stuff they noticed from the Philadelphia experiment work and the stealth work. And they were hitting these poor bastards with the microwave beam out of the Sage transmitter direct. Sage transmitter transmitted at about 400 megahertz, 406 megahertz, I believe most of the time was set at. It would hop around frequency a little. It would change in phase. It was pulse modulated. They used the amplitude concept where you had many stages pulse modulated, each one pulse slightly different to build a form in the final stage.
Do you know the specific pulse width or frequency of the pulse width?
VRF was anywhere from 10 cycles to about 750 cycles. The pulse width, depending upon how they loaded up the capacitors, the voltage could be varied anywhere from about 10 microseconds to about 75 microseconds. The center frequency was 406 megahertz, generated from a stay-low type function, which was referenced from a zero-time function.
Was there any other modulation on this? Phase modulation, frequency?
There was phase modulation, there was frequency hopping on it. Now this is as I saw it when I got on the station. I'm first trying to account what our digging and psyching and digging and talking to different people told us was the genesis of this thing. Let's keep all the technical questions till later. Okay?
But let me explain out the chronology. Phoenix 2, then it would start in 1969.
Yeah, about 69, 70, 71, somewhere in there.
Phoenix 1 went from basically from World War
48
II
to 68.
to 68.
Now, essentially, the first part of the mind control project was to take an individual, such as Duncan here, stand them maybe, 250 feet away from that antenna. As I was starting to go into what the Sage radar was capable of, the Sage radar had a peak pulse power of a half a megawatt. That's into the antenna. The antenna had a gain of 30 dB. So that means you're a megawatt. It has a peak pulse power, effective radiated power of at least a gigawatt. This is nominally a gigawatt. Can you imagine what that would do to people? I think it's amazing that the people are still here today that have been hit with this. It does such things as burn out brains, functions, and neurological damage. And you look inside of a person's lung that had this done, it'll look like the lung is all scarred from the heat generated, and it just goes on and on with physical damage done to the body by this sort of thing. They tried this with a number of people, a few survivors, in this sort of thing.
Where they get the volunteers for this?
They were just grabbing indigenous people off the street and throwing in front of the radar beam, and let's see what happens. That's the sort of nonsense that the government loves to do.
Who was in charge of the project at this time? It was covered now.
And Mr. Jack Pruitt was in charge. All right.
Along with Dr. John Van Neumann.
In any particular agency?
I'm not sure what the agency was. Now, somebody got the brilliant idea, upon the urging of the different people, they got the idea. We're not sure who came up with this idea first. The signal they really want goes through the reflector. Let's take the big banana peel, that's what's called reflector, turn around 180 degrees, and put the subjects directly in line with the gain horn feeding the antenna. Lo and behold, they got their results and then burned the people up. The poor bastards survived. They hit them with this signal. But they found out by varying the phase modulation, the frequency hopping, and the pulsing of the multiple stages, that they could have profound effects on a person's mind.
Can you describe some of them?
I think these two gentlemen here could describe them much better than I can. But let's not go into that at this point. Yeah, why not? Let's at this point break from the technical description of the first, what I consider to be the real mind control work that they had done that was successful. Let's go into some of the effects. Mr. Bielik and Mr. Cameron, I think, can do more on this than I can.
But that was the goal in mind control of this whole project.
That was the started goal.
That was the first goal.
Started.
Yeah.
And how many people more or less worked on it altogether on the base? Approximately.
That varied.
About 30.
About 30.
Who authorized them to go on the base? Who authorized them use of the base?
Air Force. The Air Force and the Navy.
Air Force and the Navy?
In conjunction? Air Force and Navy work together?
Yeah, this was a joint project. There was both Navy personnel in it and the Air Force personnel in it.
Yeah.
We even have copies of the orders of the Air Force personnel.
And what was the cover story for the base? They must have had something.
They had none.
No?
It was a derelict base
It was abandoned. It was turned over to GSA as surplus
in 1970.
around 69-70 when they shut down all the stage radar systems. In other words, there was a non-existent operation.
Right.
There was no government coverage for it. There was no government payment. There was a surplus base which allegedly had nothing on it. So it was the perfect cover. It
Where'd they get the funding?
was totally private.
Yep.
Private corporations?
Essentially.
It didn't originally come from corporations. It did in the later phases. The original money came from the Nazis, the Nazi government. In 1944, there was a raid.
That was Phoenix 1.
No, this
No,
is
that wasn't Phoenix
not
1.
Phoenix 1. This is Phoenix 2 and Phoenix 3.
Really?
Yep.
In 1944, there was a American troop train that went through a French railroad tunnel carrying $10 billion in Nazi gold, which they had found. This is documented in a movie on the old Patton scenario, in which this train was dynamited in the tunnel, killed 51 GIs, and of course Patton, who was then in Europe, decided he had to investigate this. He couldn't understand how an American troop train in the Western Territory was dynamited in a French railroad tunnel. And he was concerned about the loss of 51 GIs
And also, as it turned out, $10 billion in gold disappeared. That was $10 billion in the valuation of the then existing European prices of $20 per ounce, not 400. The gold disappeared. It turned up 10 years later in the U.S. at Montauk. This has been verified since. And that money, that gold, was used to finance the project initially and for many years, because the value went up, as the value of gold went up, to approximately 100 billion plus. And they spent all of it and ran out of money.
That's when they tapped ITT.
And that's when they tapped ITT, who then from that point on funded it, because ITT was owned by a certain German group known as the Krupps.
Okay.
And that was, again, the same Nazi connection. Now, in terms of personnel, many of the scientists, the civilian people and scientists there, were all ex-Nazis who came from Nazi Germany, either after the war was over with Werner von Braun, or were snuck in before the war, as was Dr. Unterman and a few others. But the whole thing was basically a civilian project run by the Nazis with a U.S. government surveillance, you might say. The intelligence community knew what was going on. The CIA monitored everything, as probably did other government intelligence agencies. But the field of players, if you will, those who actually operated on the base, was small, 30 to 50. And the funding was entirely private. At a very later stage, after the whole thing was over, then, I mean, after 83, there was some investigation started by a certain senator from Arizona, I think his name was Goldwater. They couldn't find any trace of government funding, no government oversight committees, no payments of money of any kind, no appropriations, nothing. They went absolutely bananas trying to figure out how a project of that magnitude and that scope could have been funded when there was no government money.
Even the senator would like to know.
That's right. See, Pruitt was Air Force. He was an Air Force colonel, I believe.
How did you get Air Force personnel assigned to a derelict base?
Right. Pruitt had his office in the Pentagon. I found that out through other connections. And he was the basic director through the whole of Phoenix 2 and 3, though actually they had two directors. They had the so-called psychic metaphysical director, which was Pruitt, and they had a hardware electronics director, who was originally Dr. Van Neumann. And after he left, Dr. Unterman took over, Hermann C. Unterman from Germany. And they also had an electronics expert who, through most of the period of time, was a Dr. Matthew E. Zarrett, who came in with Werner von Braun in 46. In fact, I understudied the man, strangely enough, in the York College of Engineering in Newark, New Jersey. He was my college prof there. And I didn't know a thing about his connections or his background or that he had come from Germany. Lo and behold, he turns up there. Private funding all the way until, well, actually 100%.
78.
Until it was over, there was still private funding through ITT.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
The government never spent a cent on it.
The gold, I think, ran until about 78.
Approximately
ITT
that.
got heavily in about 78, 79.
One of the reasons why they ran out of money was the fact that there was eventually not one base, but 25.
Yeah.
All Sage bases, 25 of them were utilized for the same program.
And
They
money
were running
went
in
all
parallel.
over.
And eventually they shut down until the end, I believe. That is the info we have, is there were only 3 still operational. They were tied together by satellite.
But they shut down quite late in the program.
Yeah. They shut
How
down.
recently were they operating? When did they finally shut down?
The last of them shut down August 12, 1983.
That was Montauk.
And that was Montauk. That was the final.
Oh,
When it went down, it shut the other 2 or whatever that were still operating with it by a satellite down. So
Well, Montauk went down, they had to go down because that's where they got their zero time. from.
correct.
Was from Montauk.
Montauk was the key station.
Yeah. So they automatically went down. All right, so is
Well, you asked, or the question was asked, what about some of the mind effects?
yeah.
I'll try to answer that and say, from what I recall of the program, because I was part of it also, as well as Duncan,
As an officer or a
civilian.
civilian who was used?
Used is
Used.
the correct term, very definitely used.
You were
Both of these
subjected
guys
to
were
the,
used.
Well, yes, I was subjected to the, let's say, the mind control field, not as I initially went in the program, because they wanted me at one point for my psychic metaphysical abilities, and you don't subject a person who is sensitive to those kind of fields, because they know they will wipe them out. or alter them so drastically that they're useless. But they assigned me to a particular part of the program involving the indoctrination of the younger recruits, we'll put it that way. And after, let us say, one of the first attempts at indoctrination, which turned out to be a total disaster, I said, there's no way I will have any part of this program, no matter what you do or say. So they said, oh, yes, you will. And I said, well, no, I won't. So they put me in front of this roasting oven, if you will, the mind beam, and it did do damage to me. And finally somebody else said, shut it off. He isn't going to give in to it. I suffered some damage, but not severe damage as some others did. And it did affect me to some extent. Duncan was affected much more heavily for other reasons. But nevertheless, the effects were, in some cases, totally disastrous. They burned brains out and the people just dropped dead. Now, neither of us were among those category, but there were other recruits, young kids they picked up, you might say, off the streets, wherever they could find them. The basic age bracket was between 12 and 16.
So that's where a lot of the disappearing
Yes.
kids disappear.
10,000, we estimate, went to Montauk. The total number would be about 250,000 with the 25 stations estimated. What the actual final directives, what the final thrust of the program was in terms of these kids, we had never come up with the answers. They wanted them fully programmed for something, and we have never found out why. And eventually they disappeared off the station. They were sent to various locations and places. But they were initially subjected to one form of programming, and then later on it changed into a somewhat more humane, a somewhat faster and less obtrusive form of programming and conditioning using the electronic techniques. The original was Reichian and was more physical and was less sophisticated. The later programs, after they worked out the techniques to use of computers, electronic programming, and the electronic use of the Reichian techniques, and it became very fast, very quick, and usually took very well with no side effects. And these kids would never know what happened to them. They ship them back to where they got them, or to wherever they wanted them to go. They would know the better.
Are you aware of the names or identities or the present locations of any of the individuals?
I've run into a number of people over the years, let's say in the last 3 years, since I've become aware of the program and the fact that I was part of it. There is a very specific field identity pattern you can detect. If you're sensitive enough to read human auras, you can spot a person that's been through the Montauk program 5 miles away. Their auras are very distinctive in the way that they have been altered. You can tell them immediately if you know what you're looking for. And I've spotted many. I would say over a dozen. Mostly in the Long Island, New York area.
Wasn't, when Newman was officially dead, right? Well,
Correct. Officially he was dead, but he was very much alive throughout this entire program, all the way through '83 and for quite some time after that, up into this year, through this year.
Oh, he's found afterwards?
Don't know exactly the whole story of what's happened to von Neumann since, because he ran into a problem with the government, and he ran into two problems. One, he suffered a personality split himself about 1977. Whether it was because of some of the experiments he was on or the strain, we don't know. But he resigned as director. He said he was no longer fit. The government wouldn't leave him alone. They wouldn't let him leave. They said he will remain as a consultant, which was agreeable to him, to the balance of the program. Because there were other reasons why he had to be there, which goes back into the whole Philadelphia experiment. But he remained on as a consultant. At the end, he told them, he says, when this program is over, he says, I'm not going to work for the government again ever, no matter what you say. He says, I'm through with you. He says, I won't further part of any of your government operations. And he retired to his little farm and led a relatively peaceful life for a period of time until he was harassed again in the last year, year and a half. That's not part of the Montauk thing.
Right. Was he living under another name then?
He was. He was
When
living under a pseudonym.
when did he officially die?
1957.
57.
That's the official death date.
What happened to the other scientists? Fruit and, was it Intamin?
Fruit was there until '83.
Yeah.
And then he went and worked in different corporations and disappeared.
Montauk was seen to turn up. You ran into him.
Yeah, a couple of times, and that was it.
Yeah, and then he
Other than
disappeared.
Ramp of the Hills, I think.
Most of them did. They ran for the hills.
Well, let's continue on the description of the Phoenix project.
I just have one more question about the Montauk. Were any of the subjects given psychotropic substances? LSD,
Magic mushrooms.
I don't know.
We don't believe so.
My gut feeling is no.
in conjunction with the
I don't believe they were.
No, they used other drugs. They had one drug that would be used in connection with the Reich programming. It would make them more receptive.
This was not.
Do you know
part
the
of
name of the drug, the chemical name, or the generic name?
No, I don't.
I have no knowledge of
Can you
that at all.
describe any of the effects of that alone, or in conjunction with the?
Okay, the effects would make you horny as hell.
Uh-huh.
That's essentially what it would do. It would make you very sexually active.
Also euphoric at the same time.
Yeah.
And euphoric?
Well, that would go along with it.
Right.
What was the purpose of being euphoric?
All right.
Make sure you
Essentially, I don't.
Or they get the chair from the aliens?
We're not sure whether they got the chair itself from the aliens, but
Did
the
they get a
technology
prototype from the
base
aliens?
came. Yes, the prototype came from the aliens.
Willingly
They
or
produced
from
it.
a crashed source?
Maybe
exchange of sorts.
we don't know.
Also, I had another question on what you were describing before. Could this experience that is becoming very common of the UFO abduction could have been programmed by
I
the
think-
government under this mind control?
Sure, it could be. Not all of it is, but some of it probably is.
Some of it.
All right. But they got this chair from the aliens, or through some connection. Another associate of ours was on the station managing money, and he actually went out and bought this chair from somebody. He hasn't been able to dig out yet who. So, what they essentially did is they took this chair, they made one computer to interface the chair itself to stay in the digital codes, and then another computer to interface it to a special computer to the transmitter, and then the transmitter. What they actually ended up with, in essence, was a mind amplifier. Duncan here, his major responsibility on the station, he was one of the selected individuals. He had been through a lot of psychic training by the government to sit in that chair and generate thought form. The idea they had is, okay, they can transmit the signature digitally, that worked very well. They could put the person in the orgasmic state digitally, that worked very well. But they wanted a human being to generate the actual thought form, the details of what they wanted done.
From the chair.
From the chair, yeah. In other words, they would put into Duncan's mind, when he's in a trance, what they want him to think of, what they want him to think of that he's doing. The chair would pick it up. After the data was sent, that would turn on the target individual. His thoughts were channeled directly through the transmitter to the individual. It worked, but it didn't work. It worked very well, extremely well. But they found another capability. Let's say they would target Phil at Tuesday, 4 a.m. when he's asleep. You might actually discover that Phil was actually hit 2 weeks later. What did they discover? They did not lock the time in of the person. What did they get? They got a time machine. Next bright idea they got was, okay, let's tell Duncan to think of a vortex connecting 1981 to 1947. He would do this. What happened? They got a vortex going from 1981 to 1947. You can walk through. Great. Now,
Duncan you had to be really good to be able to visualize. And
Duncan's very good at
you have to
visualizing.
be really imaginative, I would think.
Well, let's not go into that at this point.
Well, you're talking about it at this point. That's why I bring it up.
A master is a word in the dictionary.
It's the word I use. What you want.
Well, we're talking of earlier capabilities, not today. He was also raked over as well. But, what they discovered is, okay, The real time he thought of it. What they discovered is they recorded it, put the tape on the computer, did the same thing again. So now they had a tape that would open a vortex. And they started going back in time, they started going ahead in time, they actually got the time machine. That's the last phase of the Phoenix Project, was the time machine. Of
And
course,
they could control that time factor to where they wanted to
Yep.
go.
whatever he thought of, or other people like him. He wasn't the only one. They had to have at least 5 backups.
That was still phase 2.
That was phase 3.
Phase 3.
Yeah, was the time machine.
Now, that time machine, what do you know the date?
That got going about 79 to 80. They got that operational. Of course,
Fully operational?
yeah, about
So you
79
can
to 80.
transmit both matter and,
Thought.
signals
Yeah,
and,
right. They had this, you could walk through the vortex. You could walk in 1981 and come out in 47.
Who, Cameron would, or the one?
Anyone.
Can you explain
I
again
don't-
how was this developed?
what was the mechanism behind it?
First of all, this transmitter was so freaking powerful. This transmitter had enough power to warp space and time, go through Bearden's equations. There's more than enough power to do it. He had the capability of thinking of the vortex function that they couldn't synthesize. They didn't know how to synthesize that vortex function, but he knew. Innately, inherently, he knew how to do it.
Can it be mechanically synthesized right now?
I'm sure they got the tapes. I'm sure they got the tapes. Now, also, things they did was they would have the subject that's sitting in the chair think of a creature. And that creature would precipitate itself. They would have the subject think, there's a car coming up the road, stop the car. The car would stop, there'd be no electrical activity in it. They would have the subject in the chair think of change the direction of the fish, and the fish would do this sort of thing. They would have the subject think all the animals on Montauk Point are going to charge into the town. There's records of that even to this day, of all animal life coming off the point charging into the town. There'd be, you talk to the local kids, now they're young adults out at Montauk, that lived out at Montauk, you'll find out there's rumors of kids hearing big things stomping around the woods on the point. That's what came out of somebody's mind, precipitated through this huge mind amplifier. They almost had the power of creation. They could almost create a being. The problem they had is the being only stayed as long as the transmitter was on. Flip the switch. The being stopped all its mobility and faded back into hyperspace. But that's how powerful this thing was. This thing, you're talking gigawatts, and the etheric power probably many, many terawatts. You're talking astronomical etheric power. Because they're using multiple pulse modulators, pulse-modulated amplifiers on top of pulse-modulated amplifiers, opening different windows from the drive of this amp to that amp, and you can encode all sorts of zero-point functions as you go through what they call the amplidyne function. So the amplidyne is essentially a zero-point amplifier. So by the time they started pulsing the 100-watt stage, by the time they got out to the half a gigawatt output, the etheric power was up in the sky. This thing was tremendous. This transmitter, it took at times 2 generators supplying a megawatt each to run this thing. They were pumping 2 megawatts into this whole building, which you'll see pictures of. But, I don't think I can overstate how much power, as far as we're concerned in this room, it's astronomical power this thing had. This thing literally had, if the person who was sitting in the chair thought of a time warp and a vortex, that vortex would form.
Excuse me, does this have any military applications that you're aware of? Silly question.
I can think of thousands.
And is that why
millions of-
is that why Eastern Europe's almost free today? Because the Russians are simply scared of this? I don't know.
Who knows? There's also other thoughts that other outside groups are saying to the Earth government, you straighten up or ship out.
Well,
Who knows?
You said people could walk through this time
Yeah,
vortex.
right.
Did you ever walk through the time vortex?
No comment.
Do you know anybody that did? That
Oh, yes.
Could you describe at least the experience, or?
Al.
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
I did more than once, and it's weird, to say the least. The recollection is that you.
First of all, how was it formed? Just at the beginning, before it's created, what do you see before it's created?
Before it's created, you see nothing but the building or the area that you're in.
You're in a chair or in
No.
an open space?
No, what they finally ended up doing was they took whatever Duncan or his alternates would generate, they put it on tape.
Okay.
Now, it could generate it inside the underground area, or it could generate the.
From anywhere to anywhere.
Or
Anywhere in
generate it outside.
space-time.
It can be from any particular point where they chose to generate the origin, and it would go to the terminal
they
point.
It can
Terminal
happen while
point
you were,
was where?
The terminal point would be wherever they chose it to be.
and you could be driving a car when
Future,
this happened.
past.
You probably,
I mean, what would happen if you were driving a car?
Your car will go through it.
if your car went into the entrance of it, yes, a car would go through. And come out at the other end where it was. It could be 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 years in the future or the past.
You would actually.
You
was going that other time to describe what.
Whatever went in the beginning, the entrance would come out the other end.
I've run computer modeling.
I'm sorry?
Could the car be spatially dislocated? Could it be somewhere else in the universe?
Sure could.
Yes.
I've run computer modeling based upon calculations I've learned from the radio sirens and such, and the vortex could have a diameter of 5 miles. Could be a 5-mile opening, or of course they could bring it down
We can send
to
all of Long Island.
no.
So what was it like, Al? You were saying.
It's like looking into the entrance of a peculiar spiral tunnel which was lit all the way down. You would start to walk into this thing, and then suddenly you'd be pulled down it. You would more or less be projected. You didn't walk through it as such. You were more or less propelled through it.
You walked into it.
You walked into it, correct, start. Then you were propelled down the thing like some force grabbed you and pulled you through, and you come out the other end, wherever it is. You could be far in the past, you could be in the future, it could be very close by, and it could definitely be another place, physically, other than the point where you started and usually was.
Wherever whatever point in space and time the transmitter was set to transmit
Emphasize space and time,
Right.
because it could be anywheres in the universe.
Did you go back or forward in time?
to. Either one.
Either way.
Were you physically there? Could you interact with other things
Yes.
there?
Yes.
You could take
Did you do that?
You could take remnants back with you. You could take like for example, if you projected yourself to go to another planet, you could bring something back with you.
Sure
Yes,
you
you
could.
could.
Has
So
that
if you
been
could
done
live
to your
on the
knowledge?
other planet,
Yeah, right. I can't answer that for certain, but I would say probably.
Have you ever personally brought anything back from another time, either the past or a future?
Yes.
Was it of terrestrial origin or?
Yes, in this case it was terrestrial origin. It was a Life magazine from the year 1983 to take it back to 1943, but that's part of the Philadelphia story.
that's still continuing the Phoenix Project yet.
How big?
You guys asked the question of what it was
Okay,
like.
the description of the vortex. Please continue.
Well, the description was like a tunnel, coruscating corkscrew, sort of lit, sort of looked like the walls were,
Solid or moving?
they were solid, but they were fluted. It was not a solid bore through rock, as you would
Right.
think. It was a fluted sort of structure. And you would go down this, and you would be propelled down this tube, as it were, this tunnel, which was not straight. It was corkscrew. And it would not go in a straight line either. It would take some very strange turns, which you could not explain. But it did take turns, and you would come out at the other end, wherever you were supposed to come out, and meet somebody or do something at the other point.
Did you have like a mission?
Yes. Then you would return. Then when whatever you were doing was completed, the tunnel would reopen for you, and you go in the other direction. You walk back in it, go back to where you came from.
Exact reverse of what happened when you went there.
If someone switched off the power, would you be able to get back?
No, you'd be
No,
lost in
you'd be
time
stuck
and
there.
space.
And they never get back.
You would not get back.
People
unless-
were lost at
That's what I was
Montauk.
asking.
People were lost.
Wow.
I've heard of that.
Was everyone who went through one of these programmees?
Possibly.
Possibly, we don't know of all of those people, those young kids who were programmed, what the final intent was. We only have a little glimmering of part of it now, and this is in the last week or two, and it's very incomplete. It's been a mystery to us for a long time. What's the end goal of all of these kids being programmed? What do they want to do with them? And 10,000 there and all the other stations? There had to be a reason.
When you said people were lost, does that mean that if the machine was turned off, instant disintegration or just abandoned in that time